Hello, I'm Tom Gregory with Youngstown Christian Television. Thanks for joining us on the YouTube channel here and watching the program that you're about to see. Before you do that, if you could hit the subscribe button and join us, that way you'll always be informed of what's going on with Youngstown Christian Television every time we put a new video up on the YouTube channel. Thank you very much. We appreciate that. What's the real story? How did all of this come to be? Was it all by chance, or did something or someone design everything? Can we use science to prove that God created all that we have? How old is our world and the universe? Join us as we learn from our host, William Henry, and discover that the story of the earth and our universe is really his story.
Welcome to Discovering His Story, a program dedicated to integrating biblical truth with what we know from ancient history. I'm your host, Bill Henry, and this is a production of Youngstown Christian Television. Last week we were looking at the very first civilization following the flood and the Tower of Babel, called Sumer, or Shinar in the Bible. In Sumer, we found that there were a multitude of so-called inventions or innovations that they brought into existence, which seems remarkable for one civilization. I proposed the conclusion that these were simply ideas of knowledge that were brought forth from before the flood. They were passed on from Noah and his family. And that's why they came up with so many different ideas. Well, we were looking at the culture of Sumer, and we'd gotten last time to looking at the religion of Sumer. And we saw that An, or Anu, was the chief deity and head of the pantheon of gods in Sumer. The principal deity worshipped at Ur was the Sumerian god Nannar. Inanna, pictured here, is the goddess of love, and she was believed to bring fertility and prosperity to Sumer through her marriage to the god Dumuzi. Now, one of the things that I found out in recent years in researching the gods of Sumer is that there was a god that sounded somewhat familiar to me, and that was the god of destruction, whose name was Al-Elah, or Allah. Interesting, huh? Well, let's look at some of the mythological ideas that were associated with this Sumerian religion. The mythology of Mesopotamia and Sumer was a series of repeated stories that explained the unexplainable and was the background of the religion. The religion of Mesopotamia is the oldest religion that we have records of. Some of the things that the Mesopotamians believed was that the world was a flat disk surrounded by a vast hollow space, and that this was enclosed in an overarching heaven. The sea was all around the earth, top, bottom, and sides. The universe had been born out of these waters. Now, the Mesopotamians were polytheistic. In other words, they believed in many gods. The Sumerians were clearly in touch with the spirit world, and in matters of physical health, they relied on spiritual remedies and turned to exorcists to get rid of the demons that were possessing them. Now, one of these demons is the wind god Pazuzu. Even though he was king of the evil demons, his image was used to protect women in childbirth. This is one of the motifs in the film The Exorcist. The Mesopotamian pantheon included another of other prominent members. The Sumerian word for universe is An-Ki. This denotes the god An and the goddess Ki. An was the chief deity and head of the Sumerian pantheon of gods. Their offspring was Enlil, the air god. He is considered the most powerful god in the Sumerian pantheon. Enlil and his powers parallels the Greek god Zeus and the Roman god Jupiter. When Nimrod died, his wife Semiramis concocted a story designed to keep herself in power. She related that Nimrod had traveled to the sun to become the sun god, and then impregnated her via a sunbeam, making it a virgin birth of sorts, although Semiramis was a seriously immoral person. In other words, not a virgin at all. The child born, named Tammuz, was supposedly the reincarnation of Nimrod. As a result, Tammuz was considered to be a god incarnate and became the object of great worship. Later, Tammuz was killed by a wild boar, and Semiramis wept for her son for 40 days. Then he was resurrected. This takes place in the early spring and is associated then with the coming into the world of the flowers and all the things growing. Semiramis is perpetuated in other cultures by the names Ashtaroth in the Bible, the Queen of Babylon, Venus, Aphrodite, Diana or Artemis, Isis, Gaia, Mother Nature, and Queen of Heaven, which expression is only used of Ishtar in the Bible in the book of Jeremiah. Hundreds of other gods and goddesses were born from these Sumerian gods. Anu, god of the sky, father of the gods, the archetypical king. There is Enlil, the Lord Storm, god of wind and storms, the executive officer of the divine assembly. There is Utu, the sun god and one of the chief deities. There is Ninhursag, who is Mother Earth and the source of life. There is Enki, Lord of wisdom or Lord Earth, god of the underground fresh waters. There is Inanna, who we saw earlier, the goddess of love and war and the patron deity of Uruk. She's the mistress of the date clusters and mistress of heaven, the goddess of fertility and love, the protector of harlots. She was believed to bring fertility and prosperity to Sumer through her marriage to the god Dumuzi. She is also the goddess of the planet Venus as morning and evening star. Her name means Queen of Heaven, and she is the predecessor of the Akkadian Babylonian Ishtar. There's Dumuzi, a shepherd god who is Inanna's husband, and he is mentioned in Ezekiel 8:14. Ninurta is the son of Enlil, god of the plow. Ereshkigal is queen of the greater earth, that is the underworld. And then there is the famous Marduk or Merodach, who is the young bull of the thunderstorms, the city god of Babylon. Another interesting feature of the Mesopotamian mythological world is the Lamassu or winged bulls. We find them in different structures throughout the Mesopotamian world. Now, the whole family of gods takes up quite a bit of space. We've mentioned a lot of the ones on here, but certainly not exhaustively. But here is the family of the Sumer gods. I mentioned before the demon god, Pazuzu, and here is a sculpture of that nice-looking fellow. The gods are a window into the value system of the Mesopotamians. They valued fertility, they sought protection in war, respected wisdom, and they clearly had a reverence for the earth. According to Mesopotamian mythology, human beings were created so the gods would have servants. One Babylonian creation myth states it like this: "Man shall be charged with the service of the gods that they might be at ease." Notice that this view of God contrasts sharply with the concept that comes to us through the Hebrew and Christian traditions. In essence, if you wanted to treat the gods and goddesses right because they provided you with everything, several times a day, in an elaborate ritual, the god was served a sumptuous meal. The courses were set out before the statue of the god or goddess. Music was played and incense was sprinkled. I want to give to you an example of the daily menu for the god Anu at Uruk. This is what they would bring to him every day: 12 vessels of wine, 2 vessels of milk, 108 vessels of beer, 243 loaves of bread, 29 bushels of dates, 21 rams, 2 bulls, 1 bullock, 8 lambs, 60 birds, 3 cranes, 7 ducks, 4 wild boars, 3 ostrich eggs, 3 duck eggs, and to top it all, a Big Mac. Now, I just threw that last one in for fun. But can you imagine bringing all of those animals every day to this god Anu? Oh, these gods had a hearty appetite. The higher echelon did all the preparation, and private individuals only came into contact with the gods when statues of deities were brought out of the temple and carried through the streets. Now you might wonder, what happened to all that food they brought to the gods? Well, we don't really know for sure, but there is a story in the apocryphal books called Bel and the Dragon, which tells about Daniel's interaction with King Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel was trying to convince Nebuchadnezzar that the gods that he worshipped were false. And one of the reasons he gave for this to believe they're false was that all the food was brought to them. What happened to that food? Nebuchadnezzar says, well, that's an indication that they're real because the food's gone the next day. Daniel said, if I can prove to you that it's not the gods who are eating it, will you believe me? And Nebuchadnezzar said, sure. So Daniel went into the temple after the food was brought in, and he and some of his assistants, and sprinkled a dust or flour, something on the ground as they departed. The next morning they came in. Nebuchadnezzar said, see, all the food is gone. And Daniel said, but look at the floor. There are footprints. And the footprints led into the priest's quarters. So that's the explanation, at least in Babylon, and probably the explanation other places as well. The burial rites, well, first of all, let's look one more slide about the Mesopotamian gods. We have a creation myth we're going to talk about in a moment, and there are several of the gods and their relationship to one another. The burial rites of the Sumerians are tied to their belief in the spirit world, and they followed a strict pattern. The body was wrapped in reed matting or occasionally placed in a coffin. The corpse was laid on its side with a bowl of water between the hands near the mouth. Some treasured belongings might go in the grave. Vessels filled with food and water were placed near the body so the spirit wouldn't be hungry and return for food. The tombs were furnished according to what the family could afford, so the royal tombs were filled with treasures. Now, priests not only received and offered sacrifices, but were also in charge of collecting tithes and taxes, each payment recorded on the small clay tablets. Now, I mentioned before the Mesopotamian view of the world, and my slide here was a little bit out of place. So here we have the earth, which is a flat disk, the terrestrial ocean around it, and then there's a primordial sea which surrounds all of that. That's how they envisioned the world to be. From Sumer, we have several stories that relate to the Bible, some of which we've already mentioned. One is the Sumerian creation stories, where we have Eridu, Genesis relating the creation of man and animals. He tells of the cities and their rulers prior to the flood. There are also creation stories in Song of the Hoe, H-O-E, and Ajinki and Ninmah. Then there's the Sumerian flood story, which we've already mentioned, very similar to the biblical record. There's the Tower of Babel story. We're told that in Enmerkar and the Lord of Arata, Sumer is of one language until the Lord of Eridu estranged their tongues, which is similar to the Tower of Babel story. Shinar, or Sumer, was occupied predominantly by dark-skinned people. So these are descendants of Ham, even calling themselves black. When Semitic people gained control of Sumer, which we'll talk about later under Sargon, he boasted, "The black-headed peoples I ruled." So that takes us then to Sargon. Sargon of Akkad, or the Akkadian Empire. It begins around 3000 BC, and by 2300 BC, Sargon, who was a descendant of several before him who had entered the land of Sumer, conquered much of the area around Sumer, ruling until 2279 BC. This is essentially the first empire, the first time that a city has expanded out and captured other cities. And so we have Sargon as the first emperor of the first empire. The legend of Sargon of Akkad in Sumerian tells how Sargon was born of a priestess who put him in a basket in the river, similar to the story of Moses. A gardener found and raised him under Ishtar's protection. Sargon grew up to become the cupbearer to the king of Kish. He then overthrew the king and set up his own kingdom at Akkad. The last king of the Akkad Empire was Naram Sin, which means lover of sin. Now that doesn't mean lover of evil things. Sin, S-I-N, is simply the name for the moon goddess. There is the curse of Agade, or Akkad, because of his evil deeds. Now Sumer, whose main city was fell victim to the Guti people in the mid-22nd century BC, establishing a dynasty that lasted 100 years. In his victory stela, Utu Hengal, prince of the Sumerians, in a city of Uruk, who defeated the Guti, wrote this about the Gutians. He said, "Gutium, the fanged snake of the mountain ranges, a people who acted violently against the gods, people who the kingship of Sumer to the mountains took away, who Sumer with wickedness filled, who from one with a wife his wife took away from him, who from one with a child his child took away from him, who wickedness and violence produced within the country." So the Gutians sounded like a pretty ruthless people. They in turn then were conquered by the governor of named Namu toward the end of that century, establishing the III Empire, or the third classical Sumerian civilization. And this brings us into what happens in Genesis 12 through 15. It begins with this time of III. Became a major trading center near the Persian Gulf. As you can see, the land extends down to the Gulf there on the bottom right-hand side of the map. Presumably, they were trading the abundance of crops from the fertile Tigris and Euphrates rivers with merchants coming into the Persian Gulf. Under III, it was an absolute monarchy. This third dynasty, founded by Namu, who conquered other cities in the region. He constructed a ziggurat of in honor of the god Nana. The earliest law code comes to us from this civilization of Namu in 2095 BC. Further contributions of III are in the area of mathematics. They reached a high level of mathematics. For example, they dealt in square and cubic roots, exponents and fractions. They went by a lunar calendar which had 354 days. They were experts in astronomy, in math, in map making, surgery. Those are all things that were taught. In their religion, they had gods for each city and town, which complicated the mythology. Ishtar was the mother goddess of love and fertility, and Tammuz, here again, is the favorite sun deity. He's the deity of spring, flowers, and grain. He's also the god of the hereafter, where he lived half of the year, returning to the earth each spring. One of the most interesting things that we find from this time period is called the Sumerian King List. This was written sometime early in the second millennium BC. And this list follows the history of Sumer and Akkad by showing the succession of dynasties from the beginning of time to the time when the writer was writing. Each monarch in the early period rules for a very lengthy period, thousands of years on average. The king list abruptly and tersely mentions the Great Flood, which cuts the dynastic lines in half. After the flood, the reigns of the monarchs begin to decrease from thousands to hundreds of years. Gilgamesh, the famous hero from Uruk, ruled a mere 126 years. Eventually, the lengths of years of reigns fall within normal lifetimes. Now, on the one hand, this does a great deal to corroborate what we have in the Bible, and that is that before the flood, men lived for much longer than they did after. And so we find men like Adam living 900 and some years, and others that are living about that long. So the Sumerians apparently understood this and exaggerated. You know, their idea that the kings ruled for thousands of years was probably an overstatement, but at least an acknowledgement that people lived longer before the great worldwide flood. Now, after the Ur-3 civilization collapsed, there came an intermediate period when some other people are coming in, and there's power between different centers, basically a time in which the central government ceases to exist. And following that then, there is another group of people that comes into the empire of Sumer, into the area of Sumer. And this we call the Old Babylonian Kingdom. That's to distinguish it from the other Babylonian kingdom that we'll come to later, which is Chaldean. This is from a people called the Amorites. Sometimes it's called the Amorite Kingdom. And so the area of Sumer was taken over by these Amorites, or Elamites, sometimes they're called, in about 2004 BC. The Amorites were descendants of Shem. And so they are relatives of Abram, if Abram himself was not, in fact, a part of the Amorite group. He's considered an Amorite. It is quite possible that Abram even came from Ur, which is located in this Amorite kingdom. And in fact, I was one of the proponents of that for a number of years. But recently, I've done research which indicates to me that maybe that's the wrong Ur. And I'll give you some of the ideas here so you can see what you think. The journey from Ur to Canaan was a journey that was certainly a long ways. As we can see on the map here, on the lower part of the map, see if I can get down here is Ur, and then of course the land of Canaan is over here. In order to get there, we're told that Abram went all the way up to Haran, which we see on this closer map. Now, the problem is, why would they go up to Haran? That was not on the major route in order to get to the promised land that God had told Abram about. So many scholars believe that the biblical record doesn't fit the location of Ur over near the Persian Gulf in the Old Babylonian Kingdom. Cyrus Gordon, an archaeologist who worked at Ur in the 1930s, observed that if Abram's family left Ur of the Chaldees, as it is called in Genesis 11 and 19, and also in Nehemiah 9:7, and stopped in Haran on their way to Canaan, then Ur of the Chaldees must be located north of Haran on their way to Canaan, and southwest of Canaan in Mesopotamia. This leads to a more appealing location for Ur of the Chaldees, being the Ur located in northern Mesopotamia, the present-day Urfa. So, if went the wrong way. If the Ur of the Chaldees is actually Ur Kasdim, then, and that's north of Haran, that would make more sense for Abram to come from that area. And that was, in fact, the area of the Hittites that Abram has contact with later on in the land of Canaan. The city was called Ur in the 14th through 13th centuries BC. Ugaritic cuneiform tablets say that that is the case. A journey from Urfa to Canaan would indeed pass directly through Haran. Jews, Christians, and Muslims who live in the area all agree that Urfa is the ancient birthplace of Abraham, an identification that is also in accord with 19th century scholarship. In addition, cities in the area of Urfa bear the names of Abraham's father and grandfather, Terah and Serug. This also corresponds to the statement in Ezekiel 16:3 that, "Thus says the Lord God to Jerusalem, your origin and your birth are from the land of the Canaanite. Your father was an Amorite and your mother a Hittite," since Urfa was in Hittite territory. Finally, the addition to the name Ur may indicate that it was a colony of the original Ur located in southern Mesopotamia. So, just a little bit of side information concerning Abram and his origin, and the fact that it was probably not in the Ur about which we're talking in Ur III dynasty and in the coming of then the Amorites into that kingdom as well. So the first Babylonian dynasty started about 1900 BC, and the first greatest king of the Amorites was a man that I'm sure you've heard of, and his name was Hammurabi. He reigned from 1728 to 1686 BC, possibly a little short of that into 1750 BC. He developed a law code which many look at as being very similar to the Mosaic law code. One of the differences in Hammurabi's code is that if you were rich, you could buy your way out of trouble even if you killed someone. In addition, punishments were much more harsh for those, even if you, especially if you were of a lower socioeconomic status than those of the higher echelon. Punishments were very severe, sometimes instituting capital punishment for crimes that we would consider somewhat lesser than those that normally receive capital punishment. The Mosaic law, rather than being deemed as similar to the Code of Hammurabi, ought to be looked at as being a corrective of the kind of law code that Hammurabi produced. It counters the features of the Hammurabi law code with the limitation of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, principles that protected people from penalties that were extreme. And so the Code of Hammurabi is a famous law code that we get from ancient history. Next, we want to mention simply that the language of the old Babylonian kingdom was Akkadian. And that becomes a language that is dominant throughout the Fertile Crescent as it becomes a language of trade. The next time we're going to look further into this old Babylonian kingdom, look at the gods that are in this kingdom and the story of creation that's found there, as well as many other interesting features. Most particularly how the Epic of Gilgamesh compares to the story of the flood, line by line, at least some lines. And we'll see that next time. Remember, if you'd like an outline, go to the website, scroll down to Discovering His Story, and you'll find an outline there that you can fill in as you go along. If you missed any of the previous episodes, you can find those there as well. Many other programs are available on Youngstein Christian TV. We hope you'll enjoy them and be back with us again next week.
What's the real story? How did all of this come to be? Was it all by chance, or did something or someone design everything? Can we use science to prove that God created all that we have? How old is our world and the universe? Join us as we learn from our host, William Henry, and discover that the story of the earth and our universe is really his story.